The foreclosure notice was nailed to Henry Cartwright's door like a death warrant. 30 days to pay what he owed or lose everything his father had built from dirt and determination. He stood in the doorway of the cabin, the paper crumpled in his fist, staring out at fields that had betrayed him 3 years running. The wheat stalks stood withered and brown under the late September sun. They rustled in the wind like old bones. Henry had watched them fail inch by inch through the summer, praying for rain that never came. Now autumn had arrived with its golden light and cool mornings, beautiful as a painting and cruel as truth. He walked through the fields at sunset, boots crunching on dry earth. His father had broken this land 30 years ago, survived the hard years without firing a shot at any man, raised cattle and wheat through knowledge and sweat. The old man had taught Henry everything except how to ask for help. A man stands alone or doesn't stand at all, he'd say. Those words felt like stones in Henry's chest now. At the fence line dividing his property from the Morrison place, Henry stopped. The contrast cut deep. His side dust and failure, her side neat rows of vegetables, green and thriving, fed by the creek that ran through her half of the valley. Elizabeth Morrison moved through her garden in the fading light, gathering tomatoes in her apron. Her movements were efficient and purposeful. She was 5 years a widow, living alone on land her husband had left her. Henry had barely spoken to her in all that time. Pride kept him distant. Independence kept him cold. Now he watched lamplight glow in her cabin window as dusk settled over the valley. Two solitary figures separated by wooden rails and worlds of difference. Geese flew south in ragged V formations overhead. The cottonwoods along the creek were turning gold. Everything spoke of endings and seasons changing. Henry's throat tightened. 42 years old and facing ruin. His father's legacy slipping through his fingers like water through a sieve. He turned away from the fence line and walked back to his cabin. The door hung slightly crooked. The roof needed patching. Inside, the rooms felt cold even before winter arrived. He lit a lamp and sat at the table his father had built. The foreclosure notice spread before him like an accusation. 29 days remaining. Through the window, he could see lamplight from Elizabeth's cabin glowing warm across the gap between their properties. She would be having supper now, he thought. Maybe reading by the fire. Self-sufficient and serene. He looked down at his own cold hearth, the ashes from last night's fire gray and dead. A man stands alone or doesn't stand at all. The words echoed hollow now. Henry blew out his lamp and sat in darkness, watching that distant light until it too went dark. Then there was nothing but the sound of wind through dry wheat and the weight of failure pressing down like stones. Elizabeth Morrison appeared at Henry's door the next morning with 2 cups of coffee and a directness that cut through the autumn chill. She didn't wait for an invitation. She simply stood there, gray eyes level and steady. A woman who'd learned to speak plainly when plain speaking mattered. "I know about the bank," she said. Henry felt his jaw tighten. "News travels. Small towns talk. I'm not here to gossip." She held out one of the cups. "I'm here with a business proposal." He took the coffee because refusing would have been childish. It was hot and strong, better than anything he'd made himself in months. She waited while he drank, patient as stone. "I don't need pity, Mrs. Morrison," he said finally. "Good. I'm not offering any—" She set her own cup on the porch rail. "I'm offering partnership. My capital against your labor and land knowledge. Profit-sharing arrangement until you're solvent, then equal split thereafter." The words landed like physical blows. Henry felt heat rise to his face. "I don't take charity from women." "It's not charity, Mr. Cartwright. It's business." Her voice didn't rise, but it hardened. "I've got money sitting in the Prescott Bank earning modest interest. You've got land and knowledge going to waste. We could help each other, or we could both stay small and safe and alone." "I'm doing fine alone." "Are you—" She gestured at his failing fields. "Because from where I'm standing, alone looks a lot like losing everything." The truth of it burned worse than the coffee. Henry set the cup down harder than he meant to. What do you get out of this, profit from good land properly worked? Partnership with someone who knows cattle and wheat. She paused. And maybe the satisfaction of keeping a good claim from going to the bank for nothing. I don't need saving rescue. Elizabeth's eyes flashed. No, you need partnership. You need help. And you're too proud to ask for it, so I'm offering it straight. It's partnership or watch you lose everything your father built. Your choice. Henry wanted to argue. Wanted to send her back across that fence line to her tidy garden and her widow's independence. But 29 days sat like a countdown in his skull. 3 years of failure stretched behind him. Pride was cold comfort against winter. I need to think on it, he said. Think fast. The bank doesn't wait on wounded feelings. She picked up both cups. Offer stands through tomorrow. After that, I'll assume you'd rather fail alone than succeed with help. She walked back toward the fence line, her stride steady and sure. Henry watched her go. Anger and shame wrestling in his chest. The sun climbed higher. The field stayed brown and broken. Inside his cabin, the foreclosure notice waited like a ticking clock. That night, he sat at his father's table with the notice in front of him and Elizabeth's words circling his mind like vultures. 28 days now. The lamp flickered. Outside, darkness pressed against the windows, across the gap between properties. Lamplight glowed in Elizabeth's cabin. She was right, and he knew it. Pride was all he had left. But pride wouldn't pay the bank. Pride wouldn't save his father's legacy. Pride was just another word for stubborn and stubborn men died alone with their principles intact and their land sold to strangers. Henry looked at the foreclosure notice one more time. Then he blew out his lamp and went to bed, knowing what morning would bring, knowing that survival meant swallowing everything his father had taught him about standing alone, knowing that sometimes the hardest thing a man does is admit he needs help. Henry walked to Elizabeth's cabin at sunset the next day, hat in his hands like a supplicant. The light was going golden and soft, the kind of evening that made the valley look like something from a painting. It didn't match the shame burning in his throat. She answered the door before he knocked, as if she'd been watching for him. Mr. Cartwright, Mrs. Morrison. He cleared his throat. About that proposal. Come in. She stepped back, gesturing to her kitchen table. The cabin was warm and neat, the smell of fresh bread hanging in the air. A lamp burned steady on the table where papers waited beside an inkwell and pen. Henry sat across from her, the table between them feeling wider than the valley outside. She'd already written out the partnership terms in her precise script. She explained each point clearly, her voice businesslike and calm. Equal say in all planting decisions. Shared labor. 60-40 profit split in your favor until the debt's cleared. Then 50-50 thereafter. Partnership dissolves only by mutual agreement or death. She looked up at him. Does that sound fair? More than fair. His voice came out rough. You're taking all the risk. I'm investing in good land and a good farmer. She pushed the paper toward him. Sign if you agree. Henry read through it slowly, though the words swam a bit. His education had been frontier basic, enough to manage accounts and read contracts. This was clear and simple and fair, more fair than he deserved. He thought of his father then. Wondered what the old man would say. Probably something about standing alone, about a man's pride being worth more than gold. But his father had never faced 3 years of drought and a bank notice counting down to nothing. Henry picked up the pen. His signature looked rough and crude next to her elegant script, like comparing a fence post to fine furniture. When it was done, he set the pen down and couldn't meet her eyes. We start tomorrow, Elizabeth said quietly. Fall plowing won't wait for pride to settle. Yes, ma'am. And Mr. Cartwright. She waited until he looked up. This is partnership, not charity, not rescue. We're in this together now, equal weight on both sides. Remember that. He nodded, not trusting his voice. She walked him to the door, outside. The last light was fading from the sky. Stars were starting to show. "Dawn comes early," she said. "Meet me at the fence line." Henry walked home through the gathering dark, the partnership papers folded in his pocket. The shame was still there, hot and bitter, but underneath it, something else stirred, something that felt almost like hope. He lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling. His father's voice echoed in memory, "A man stands alone or doesn't stand at all." But his father had never known Elizabeth Morrison, never faced a woman who offered partnership with dignity instead of pity, never had to choose between pride and survival. Henry thought about the fence line between their properties. Tomorrow he'd cross it as a partner, not just a neighbor. The boundary would still be there, wooden rails weathered gray. But somehow it felt different now. Less like protection, more like a line he'd been too afraid to cross until necessity forced his hand. Outside, an owl called across the valley. The wind moved through the dry wheat with its whisper of endings. But morning would bring new work, new purpose. The partnership was signed. The shame would fade or it wouldn't. Either way, the land needed tending and the clock was still counting down. 27 days to save everything or lose it all. He finally slept as midnight passed, dreaming of wheat fields green and growing, of partnership meaning something more than failure dressed up in fancy words. Henry arrived at the fence line before dawn, but Elizabeth was already there hitching her team. She looked up at his approach and nodded once, then went back to checking the harness. No morning pleasantries, just work to be done. They started with his failed wheat fields, plowing under 3 years of disappointment. The earth turned dark and rich beneath the blades, hiding the withered stalks. Henry guided his team while Elizabeth worked hers. 2 outfits moving in parallel across the land. The October sun climbed higher, warming their backs. By mid-morning, they'd covered half the north section. Henry stopped to water the horses, wiping sweat from his face. Elizabeth pulled up alongside, her own team breathing hard. "Your father planted in straight rows," she said, studying the field. "Creek floods every 3rd spring through here. Contour plowing would hold the water better." Henry felt his jaw tighten. She was right. But the automatic defensiveness rose anyway. "Been planting straight rows 30 years. And losing topsoil every flood." She pulled out a canteen, took a drink, offered it to him. "Just a suggestion." He took the canteen, the gesture somehow more intimate than the words. The water was cool and tasted faintly of mint. He drank and handed it back. "Show me what you mean." She sketched the contour pattern in the dust with a stick, explaining how following the land's natural curve would trap water instead of channeling it away. It made sense. Simple physics he should have thought of himself. "We'll try it your way," he said finally. "Our way now." She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "That's what partnership means." They worked until sunset, laying out the contour lines, adjusting the pattern to match the land's flow. It was slower than straight rows, but felt right somehow. Henry found himself watching how she moved, efficient and sure, never wasting motion. She knew soil and seed as well as he did, maybe better, when his mule balked at a gopher hole, rearing and kicking. Elizabeth's laughter surprised him, not mocking but genuinely amused. "Your mule's got opinions," she said. "He's got stubbornness. Whole family does. Lucky for you. So do I." She grinned, and something in Henry's chest loosened slightly. By week's end, they'd established a rhythm. Dawn meetings at the fence line. Days working side by side, sharing water and tools and the occasional word. She'd hand him things before he asked for them. He'd adjust his pace to match hers without thinking about it. The fence line stayed between their properties, wooden rails weathered and gray. But they met at it every morning now, crossing it a dozen times a day as the work required. The boundary was becoming less about division and more about connection, a meeting point rather than a barrier. Friday evening. Henry stood looking at a week's work, 10 acres plowed and ready for winter wheat. Done the right way. Elizabeth came up beside him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked. "Dawn's dawn," he said. "I'll be here." She nodded and headed back to her cabin. Henry watched her go, then turned to survey the fields again. Partnership. The word had felt like defeat when he signed those papers. Now it felt like something else. Like maybe his father hadn't known everything. Like maybe standing alone wasn't the only way to stand at all. The lamp in her cabin window glowed as darkness fell. Henry went home to his own cold hearth, but for the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than failure weighing on his shoulders. It wasn't hope yet, but it wasn't despair either. It was something in between, something that tasted like possibility. November brought the first snow, light dustings that melted by noon. Henry and Elizabeth merged their small cattle herds for easier winter feeding, running them together in the pasture that straddled both properties. The work drew them closer by simple necessity. Shared meals became routine, alternating cabins because walking back and forth in the cold made no sense. December deepened the cold. They planted winter wheat between storms, racing the freeze. Henry started noticing small things: how Elizabeth took her coffee black, how she hummed while working, how her hands never stopped moving even when she was thinking. She noticed things about him too. He could tell. The way she'd hand him tools left-handed because she'd seen he favored that side. The way she'd start coffee before he arrived at dawn. January brought the blizzard that changed everything. It hit on a Tuesday, wind screaming down from the north with snow so thick you couldn't see 10 feet. Henry had gone to Elizabeth's barn to help with evening feeding when the storm trapped them both. The cattle needed tending. Water needed hauling. No choice but to wait it out. They worked in lamplight, the barn creaking under wind pressure. Snow found every crack and gap, dusting the hay bales white. The cattle huddled close, their breath steaming. Outside, the world disappeared into white fury. "Could be worse places to be stuck," Elizabeth said, forking hay into the feeding trough. "Could be better, too." Henry hauled water from the pump they'd installed inside the barn for exactly this reason. His shoulders ached from the repeated trips. They worked in companionable silence for a while. Then Elizabeth spoke quietly. "My husband died 3 years ago this month. Widowmaker tree fell on him while he was cutting firewood." Henry stopped, bucket in hand. She'd never talked about her husband before. He was a good man, careful and kind. She kept working, not looking at Henry. The life insurance money came as a shock. We'd never had more than enough to get by. Suddenly I had security and no one to share it with. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I grieved him proper." She set the pitchfork aside. But that money sitting in the bank felt like hiding from living. Like I was so scared of losing again that I wasn't willing to risk anything. The wind howled. The lamp flickered. Henry understood what she was saying, what she wasn't saying. "I was married once," he heard himself say. "Young and stupid in love. Sarah was 17 when we wed. 18 when she died trying to birth our daughter." Elizabeth turned to face him fully now. "Lost them both in one night." The words came hard but necessary. "Buried them in the spring when the ground thawed. After that, I figured loving anything was just asking for pain. Easier to stay alone, work the land, not need anybody." "Easier," Elizabeth said softly, "but lonelier." "Yes," he set the bucket down. "Been alone so long I forgot what it cost." The blizzard screamed outside. Inside the barn, warmth from cattle and lamplight created a small pocket of shelter. They stood facing each other across bales of hay. Two people who'd learned that safety and living weren't always the same thing. "The partnership's working," Elizabeth said. "Better than I expected." "Me too." She smiled slightly. "Turns out you're not as stubborn as you pretend. Turns out you're more stubborn than you admit." They finished the feeding in quiet accord. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving drifts 3 feet deep and a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Henry trudged home through snow that squeaked under his boots, but he kept thinking about the barn, the conversation. the way she'd looked at him in the lamplight. That afternoon, working to clear snow from the barn roof, he found his winter coat mended where it had torn. Neat stitches, done by hand, Elizabeth's work. He hadn't asked. She'd just done it. A week later, checking her barn in the morning cold, Elizabeth found the door he'd fixed planed smooth and rehung so it no longer dragged. Henry's work. He hadn't mentioned it. Neither spoke of these small kindnesses, but both noticed. Partnership was becoming something more, something neither quite knew how to name yet. But winter was teaching them both sometimes warmth only comes from standing close to someone else's fire. February's ice storm hit without warning, temperatures plunging overnight. Henry woke to the sound of trees cracking under the weight. By dawn, the whole valley glittered like broken glass. The real damage showed itself by afternoon. The irrigation system they both depended on, the wooden flumes and channels that diverted creek water to, their fields had collapsed under ice weight. Without it, spring planting would fail. Both properties would suffer. Henry met Elizabeth at the wreckage, both staring at splintered wood and twisted metal. The creek ran free and useless below, mocking their need. "We rebuild it or we're both dry come spring," she said. "Needs to be done before the thaw or we lose our chance," Henry calculated in his head. 2 weeks of brutal work. Maybe 3. Can't do it alone. Good thing you're not alone anymore. They started that afternoon, working in cold that turned fingers numb in minutes. The ice made every step treacherous, every handhold uncertain. They sledgehammered ice dams, cleared channels, hauled lumber from Elizabeth's woodpile and Henry's storage both. Days blurred into brutal routine, dawn to dusk, breaking ice and rebuilding what the storm had destroyed. The work demanded everything's strength, patience, careful planning. Henry's old instinct screamed to handle it solo, prove he didn't need help. But that instinct would have killed him. The job needed 4 hands, 2 backs, double the determination. Midnight of the 4th day found them working by lantern light, racing a warming trend that would turn ice to flood if they didn't finish the creek bank reinforcement. Henry was crossing the half-frozen creek with a load of stones when his boot hit ice instead of rock. His feet went out from under him. He dropped the stones, reaching desperately for balance. Then Elizabeth's hand clamped around his forearm, strong and sure, pulling him back from the edge. They stood close in the darkness, both breathing hard. Her hand stayed on his arm. His hand had found her shoulder. The creek rushed below them, black and cold and indifferent. "Can't afford to lose you now," she said quietly. "We're just getting this partnership running smooth." But her hand lingered on his arm an extra heartbeat. His fingers pressed slightly against her shoulder. Something unspoken passed between them, warm despite the cold, not quite acknowledged, not quite ignored. "Careful," was all Henry said, but he meant more than just the ice. They finished the work by dawn, exhausted and filthy and triumphant. The infrastructure held. The creek ran through proper channels. Come spring, water would flow where they needed it. Standing at sunrise, surveying what they'd saved together, Elizabeth spoke softly. "We make a good team." "Better than good," Henry agreed. Then, because the moment seemed to demand honesty, "Couldn't have done this without you. Wouldn't have tried without you." She turned to face him. "That's what partnership means, I think. Not just dividing labor, making something neither of us could make alone." Henry nodded, not trusting his voice. The sun climbed higher, gilding the ice-covered valley in gold. His hands ached, his back screamed, but something in his chest felt lighter than it had in years. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked. "Dawn's dawn," he said, and she smiled. Walking home through glittering ice, Henry realized the fence line between their properties barely registered anymore. He crossed it a dozen times a day without thinking. The boundary was still there physically, but it had stopped meaning separation. Now it just marked where his land met hers, where partnership made them both stronger. He slept that afternoon, dreamless and deep. When he woke, evening was falling. Through his window he could see lamplight in Elizabeth's cabin. He thought about the way her hand had caught his arm, the way they'd stood close in the darkness. Thought about how partnership no longer felt like an adequate word for what was growing between them. But he was afraid to name it, afraid that speaking it aloud might break whatever careful thing they were building. So he kept silent and kept working and kept meeting her at dawn like always. Partnership becoming something more one careful day at a time. March brought the killing frost on a Tuesday night. Temperatures dropping 20 degrees in 3 hours. Henry woke at 3 in the morning with the certainty that something was wrong. He pulled on boots and coat and ran to the wheat fields. The winter wheat had just started sprouting, green shoots pushing through dark soil. Now those shoots were wilting under frost's touch, dying as he watched. 3 years of failure rushed back. 4 years if this crop died. The foreclosure was paid, but barely. Another loss would break them both. He stood alone in the field at 3 a.m., watching green turn to brown-edged black, and felt despair settle over him like a shroud. All the work, all the partnership, all the careful hope dying under stars that glittered cold and indifferent. Dawn found him still standing there, numb with more than cold. He heard footsteps but didn't turn. "How bad?" Elizabeth's voice, steady despite the hour. "Bad enough." His own voice sounded dead. 3/4 gone, at least. "Then we save the quarter that's left." She moved to stand beside him. "We've got smudge pots in both barns. Enough hands between us to cover the surviving sections. Might save half if we move fast." "Elizabeth." "No." She cut him off. "No giving up. No standing here watching it die. We fight for what we can save, and we do it now." She was already walking back toward her barn, calling out orders like a general. Henry stood frozen another moment. Then something in him broke free. Not hope exactly, just refusal to quit. He followed her. They worked through the day, setting up smudge pots, calculating coverage, preparing for another brutal night. But this time, they weren't alone. Neighbors started arriving mid-afternoon. Old Tom Henderson from 2 valleys over, who'd never spoken more than 10 words to Henry, showed up with his sons in a wagon full of pots. "Heard you might need hands," was all he said. The Schultz family arrived next, then the McCarty brothers, then people Henry barely knew. All coming because Elizabeth had helped them before, lending tools or labor or seed when they needed it. All coming because frontier survival meant cooperation, meant community, meant nobody stands alone when neighbors are hurting. By sunset, they had 30 people spread across the fields, setting fires, nursing heat, fighting frost with everything they had. The work was backbreaking and endless. Smoke filled the valley. Flames dotted the darkness like earthbound stars. Henry worked alongside Elizabeth, both moving through the rows, checking temperature, adjusting coverage. His hands were black with soot, his lungs burned from smoke. But around him, people were fighting for his crop like it mattered to them personally. "Why?" he asked Elizabeth at midnight, both of them taking a brief rest. "Why did they all come?" "Because I asked. Because you're worth helping." She wiped soot from her face. "Because that's what people do when someone finally stops pretending they don't need anybody." The words hit harder than the cold. Henry looked around at neighbors working his fields, saving his wheat, giving their night and effort freely. He'd spent years convinced that needing help meant weakness. Now he saw the truth: accepting help meant you were worth helping. Refusing it just meant you died alone. Dawn came finally, pink and cold. They'd worked straight through. All of them. The frost had done damage, no question. But the smudge pots had saved 70% of the crop. 70% of something instead of 100% of nothing. Henry stood in smoke-hazed sunrise, filthy and exhausted, surrounded by neighbors who were packing up their pots and heading home to their own work. He tried to thank them. Words felt inadequate. "Just pay it forward when someone else needs help," Tom Henderson said, clapping his shoulder. "That's how it works out here." When the last neighbor had gone, Henry and Elizabeth stood alone in the field, both exhausted beyond words. both alive with something that felt like triumph. "We did it," she said quietly. "Not you. Not I. We." Henry looked at her soot-smudged face, her tired eyes, her smile that said everything about belief and stubbornness and refusing to quit. Something in his chest shifted, settled, found its place. "Couldn't have done this without you," he said. "Not just the fighting, all of it, the partnership, the planning. That's the secret my husband knew and your father didn't." Elizabeth's voice was gentle. "Alone is just alone, but together is strength multiplied." The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the smoke. The wheat that remained stood green and strong, saved by cooperation and community, and two people who'd learned that partnership means you don't face the darkness alone. Henry understood then what his father had never taught him: asking for help wasn't failure. It was wisdom. And accepting partnership wasn't weakness. It was the strongest thing he'd ever done. May brought warmth and growth. The wheat that survived the frost grew strong and abundant, fed by the irrigation system they'd rebuilt together. By June, it stood golden and ready. More wheat than Henry's fields had produced in 5 years. The harvest came in over 3 long days. Neighbors returned to help. Payment for the times Elizabeth had helped them. The yield exceeded every projection. Henry ran the numbers twice, not believing them. Not just enough to survive, enough to thrive, enough to prove the partnership worked. He rode to Prescott the day after harvest ended, withdrew every dollar he owed Elizabeth plus 20% interest, and rode back with the money in his saddlebag. The weight of it felt like freedom and obligation both. Sunset was painting the valley gold when he knocked on Elizabeth's door. She answered with flour on her hands, clearly in the middle of baking. Her smile faded when she saw his expression. "Henry, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." He stepped inside, set his hat on the table. "Everything's right, actually. The crop paid better than projected." "That's wonderful. Which means I can do this." He opened the saddlebag and laid the money on her kitchen table. Bills in neat stacks, counted 3 times. "Every cent I owe you, plus 20% interest. The debt's cleared. Elizabeth." She stared at the money, then at him. "I see. Partnership terms said until I was solvent. I'm solvent now." His voice sounded steadier than he felt. "You're free of the agreement if you want." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out and slowly pushed the money back toward him. "I didn't want repayment. Henry, I wanted a partner. The debt's cleared." He didn't understand. "You took all the risk and made a profit, if that's how we're counting." She moved to the window, looking out over both properties. The fence line between them was still there but barely visible now, softened by shared work and merged operations. But I wasn't counting that way. I never was. Henry felt something shift in his chest. "What were you counting?" "Partnership that works. Land that's productive. Someone to share the burden with." She turned to face him. "I don't want the partnership to end. Henry, I want to make it permanent." Permanent how? Legal partners. Formal papers. Your land and mine run as one operation. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held uncertainty. "Unless you'd rather go back to working alone now that you can afford to." The question hung between them. Henry looked at the money on the table, looked at Elizabeth framed by the window with sunset light gilding her hair, looked at everything they'd built together over 8 months of shared labor. "I've been alone long enough," he said quietly. "Turns out I'm not very good at it." "Neither am I." And I think he stopped, gathered his courage. "I think maybe partnership means more than just land and crops." "What else does it mean?" Her voice was soft now, barely above a whisper. "Means 2 people who work well together, who trust each other, who've built something neither could build alone." He took a step closer. "Means equals in business, and maybe, if you're willing, equals in everything else too." Elizabeth's eyes brightened. Are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking if you'd consider a different kind of partnership. One that doesn't end with balanced ledgers or cleared debts. He was close enough now to see gold flecks in her gray eyes. I'm asking if you'd marry me. Elizabeth Morrison, equal partners in everything. She didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, and Henry's heart hammered. Then she smiled, slow and certain. Yes, one word, but it changed everything. Henry reached for her hand, and she gave it freely, their fingers intertwining like they'd been working side by side all these months. Natural and right. Equals in business, she said. Equals in everything. 2 farms become 1. 2 people become family. The money sat forgotten on the table. Outside, darkness was falling over fields they'd saved together. Land they'd worked as partners. Inside, lamplight glowed warm, and 2 people who'd learned that strength comes from standing together faced a future. Neither had to face alone. Henry pulled her close, her head fitting against his shoulder like she belonged there. Like maybe she'd always belonged there, and they'd both just been too afraid or proud or wounded to see it. When? She asked. Soon as you'll have me. Next month. Then, September. 1 year after you signed the partnership papers. Fitting. Henry agreed. Full circle. From desperate agreement to chosen commitment. From business arrangement to something that felt like coming home. They stood together as night fell. Already planning. Already imagining. Already building with words what they'd been building with actions all along. A life that was stronger. Together than either could manage alone. July brought heat and growth in the quiet work of preparation. Henry and Elizabeth spent long evenings planning not just a wedding, but a merged life. The fence line between properties finally came down, rails stacked for firewood. 2 operations became one officially. Papers signed and filed in Prescott. Neighbors noticed and approved. Talk ran through the valley about the partnership that had become something more. About 2 stubborn people who'd learned that asking for help wasn't weakness. About cooperation, breeding success when pride would have meant failure. On a warm July evening, Henry found Elizabeth in what had been her garden. Was now their garden. She was checking tomatoes, the late sun turning everything gold. He watched her for a moment, still getting used to the idea that this capable, strong woman had chosen partnership with him. Penny for your thoughts, she said without looking up. Thinking about fences. What about them? How they mark boundaries. Keep things separate. He moved to stand beside her. How sometimes taking them down is the bravest thing you can do. She smiled, understanding. You're not talking about property lines anymore. No, he wasn't. Talking about the fences we build in ourselves. The ones that keep people out because we're scared of needing them. And I think I spent too many years behind those fences. He took her hand. Thank you for being stubborn enough to cross them. Thank you for letting me. She squeezed his fingers. We're good for each other. Henry Cartwright. Better than good. Elizabeth Morrison. September came with golden light and cool mornings. The wedding was simple, held at the Morrison cabin with neighbors gathered around. No fancy church, no elaborate ceremony. Just 2 people making promises in front of witnesses who'd help them both survive the hard year. The minister spoke briefly about partnership and covenant. Henry listened but mostly watched Elizabeth beside him, steady and sure in a simple blue dress. When the time came for vows, his voice didn't shake. I promise to be your partner in everything. To share the burden and the blessing. To stand with you. Not alone anymore. Her vows matched his in simplicity and truth. I promise to be your equal and your help. To work beside you and build with you. To choose us over me. Every day. They sealed it with a kiss that felt like homecoming and new beginning both. The celebration after was frontier simple food shared. Music played on fiddles. Dancing in the yard. Neighbors who'd helped save the wheat crop came to celebrate the partnership becoming permanent. The valley had taught them all cooperation conquers isolation. As evening fell, Guests departed with handshakes and well wishes. Henry and Elizabeth stood alone finally, watching the last wagon disappear down the valley road. "Ready?" she asked. "For what? The rest of it? Marriage? Building a life? All of it?" Henry looked at the land spread before them. 2 farms now unified. Looked at the cabin they'd expanded together. His father's old place made new. Looked at the woman beside him who'd refused to let him fail alone. More than ready, they walked together toward the cabin, her hand in his. Lamplight glowed warm through windows. Smoke rose from the chimney. Inside, supper waited on a table set for 2 instead of 1. At the threshold, Henry paused. This was the cabin where he'd received the foreclosure notice 12 months ago, where he'd sat alone in darkness, convinced that isolation was strength. Now lamplight and warmth and partnership filled every corner. "What is it?" Elizabeth asked. "Just thinking how different everything is." "Better different? Best different?" He squeezed her hand. "Thank you for not taking no for an answer. Thank you for being smart enough to eventually say yes." They crossed the threshold together, partners in everything now. The door closed behind them on a valley gone blue with dusk. 2 farms had become one. 2 wounded people had become family. The land had taught them both what his father never learned. Sometimes the strongest thing you can build requires more than 1 pair of hands. Inside, lamplight glowed and supper waited, and 2 people who'd chosen each other began building their life together. Equal in business and equal in love. Partnership meaning everything a marriage should be shared burden. Doubled joy. And the knowledge that whatever came next, neither one would face it alone.